It's a survey of businesses and households. Fun fact, I actually used to know a girl who worked for the BLS here in Chicago. She was one of the data collectors, so I learned a lot about that collection process, probably more than I wanted to know, but it was definitely interesting. So they definitely do these type of surveys. Prices are collected in 75 urban areas from about 23,000 retail and service establishments. The CPI survey collects about 94,000 prices, and the data on rents are collected from about 50,000 landlords or tenants. So it covers the consumption sector of the US economy, which is defined as the purchase of goods and services for use by households. And it's arranged into 8 major groups. So we've got food and beverages. So think of like breakfast cereal, milk, coffee, chicken, wine, full service meals, snacks, things like that. We have housing, which is rent of primary residence, owner's equivalent rent, utilities, even bedroom furniture. We have apparel, men's shirts, women's dresses, baby clothes, shoes, jewelry. Transportation, new vehicles, airline fares, gasoline, major vehicle insurance. We have medical care, that's like prescription drugs, medical equipment and supplies, eyeglasses, hospital services. We have recreation, that's going to be televisions, toys, pets, pet products, sports equipment. Education and communication, so think of college tuition, telephone services, computer software and accessories. And then we have other goods and services. So that's kind of things like, haircuts and other personal services, funeral expenses, for example. So CPI's objective is to calculate the change in the amount consumers need to spend to maintain a consistent level of satisfaction. From that CPI, we get 2 measures. We get the headline number and we get the core number. Now, the core number, the goal, of course, is to, it takes out food and energy. What it's trying to do, or what it attempts to do, is to remove the more volatile components of CPI. And that adjustment, or that attempt to remove the volatile components, is what other measures look to solve. So let's take a look at some of these alternative measurements. And the first we'll start with, of course, is from the Atlanta Fed. This is the Atlanta Fed Sticky Price CPI. And again, this comes from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Here's the webpage. You can certainly take a look at it if you get an opportunity. The president of the Atlanta Fed is Raphael Bostic. So if you follow the Fed at all, it's a very familiar name. But before we dive in, to better understand the sticky price CPI, let's take a step back for just a moment. If we're talking about inflation, what we're really talking about is 2 different forces. We're talking about inflation expectations of the public, and we're talking about slack in the economy. Those inflation expectations affect decisions for many things, from wages, pricing decisions, spending habits, right? The slack is what influences the pricing power of firms and workers. So the concept here is that some of the items in the CPI change prices frequently, while others are slow to change. The Atlanta Fed looks at these and defines them as sticky and it's flexible. Those sticky prices may not respond to changing market conditions as quickly. It's these sticky prices that incorporate expectation about future inflation. So if they are slow to change when they are set, it's reasonable to assume that there's a degree of inflation forecasting behind them because changing prices can involve significant costs. And these costs can greatly reduce the incentives of firms to change prices. So therefore, they'll probably want to account for inflation between those price changes, especially if they're not doing them as frequently. The flexible prices are those that change on a more frequent basis. So those prices are more responsive to economic changes. They don't have the same restraints to price changes that the sticky ones do, hence the idea of slack, which is tied to pricing power. So the flexible prices reflect the current trends, while the sticky prices are more forward-looking. So the next question, of course, is, well, what time frame separates the sticky from the flexible? And the Atlanta Fed actually uses a study from 2004. Here's the actual study itself, Mark Bills and Peter Clino. The research has been based on these indicators that they're looking at. It's based on, and then based on their findings, we can see that the average price change is about 4.3 months. So essentially, what the Atlanta Fed said was, look, they've done the research here. We're going to base the indicator off their research, and they thought that that was a natural separation point, 4.3 months. So if we take a look, here's the breakdown. Now, the breakdown itself is interesting because there's a few important takeaways here. And the first one I want to point out is that about 70% of that number, of the headline number, is made up of sticky price goods. And the other 30 is the flexible part right here. Also, about half of the flexible are food and energy, right? So just about half. So you can see why the core looks to remove those. The sticky price actually includes many service-based categories, including medical services, education, personal care services. So ironically, when Powell talks about inflation being sticky, what is he talking about? Well, services mostly. And so you can see why that's been a sticking point here recently when we talk about inflation and, of course, services. Another interesting point is that the sticky price includes most of the housing categories. And if we filter those out, we're left with something similar to that super core PCE, right? That something that Powell's been watching for quite some time. So just from those observations alone, it should be a bit clearer as to why we've been focused on services and housing recently, right? When we compare them to where those sticky prices are. So now that we understand what we're looking at, let's take a quick look at some of the data itself. Here I put up a chart. This is the different sticky components. And as you can see, we've got the headline number, that sticky price consumer price index. We've got the core, the sticky price less the food and energy. I put in the sticky price less the food, energy, and shelter. So that's that super core that we've been talking about, or that super core is similar to that PCE. And we also have a sticky price less shelter. So we can make a few observations here. And the reason I included this will become apparent in just a moment. But first, we can clearly see, right, this large gap in between the two different sets of lines. And the top two lines are that sticky price CPI and the sticky price core. The bottom two lines represent the sticky price less shelter and the sticky super core. So you can see now why I included this sticky price less shelter. We know that the difference between these two sets of lines, we know what that is. The gap is clearly due to shelter. And this has obviously been a real thorn in the Fed's side. Powell said on many occasions that they've been watching the shelter component. He also said that he was confident that the housing costs would start to trend lower, but there was a little bit of uncertainty about when that would happen. In other words, they'd like to see that gap narrow, right? They want to see this particular gap between these prices narrow. Um, Now, I don't want to get off on a tangent, but there are some quirks to the shelter component. The most noted right now that's been in, Powell's talked about at the last FOMC is market rents. If think of it this way, basically landlords tend not to raise rents as much for current tenants. So the shelter component is grabbing the price shock of those moving for the first time in many years. That dynamic is distorting the data somewhat and may not fully cycle through the data for some time, hence the desire to exclude it when looking at inflation dynamics. So going forward, we could also add the CPI core to the mix. So here's another look at those numbers in the CPI core. And you can now see that CPI core is just about the middle of that gap. So for now, let's just stick with that super core, no pun intended. But let's take a look. What I've done here is this is looking at the sticky super core, right? So again, that's that less food, energy, and shelter. This is looking at over the most recent Fed hiking cycles. And as you can see, first of all, we started in uncharted waters, right? Way higher than it had been in the past cycles. But by the time of our last hike, we'd made substantial progress, right? And that's this level right here, this 3.2. The blue line is the 1994 cycle, and this is often considered a soft landing. But what I really want to focus on is this highlighted part right here, this yellow highlight. This is where we were at the time of the December FOMC. And that obviously FOMC was a very different feeling FOMC. You can see why Powell at that particular one was feeling confident, right? In fact, that was the first mention of rate cut at that point. So things seem to be moving down in an orderly fashion, right? We made huge progress. We're moving lower. Unfortunately, as you can see, we ticked up from there. Powell even acknowledged that the last leg of the journey would be a bumpy road. And so even at 3.1%, we're below the level of the last hike. And keep in mind, we don't need to be, and they've said this many times, we don't need to be at 2% before they start cutting. We just need that to turn back down, right? We need this to turn back down and start heading back towards that highlighted area. Again, this is what they mean by, more confidence, right? So that's the sticky price CPI from the Atlanta Fed. And now let's take a trip north. We're going to go to Cleveland Fed. And what they have is a couple of different indicators here. Loretta Mester is the president here, very respected voice within the Fed. Probably one of my favorite Fed officials. I think that she has a lot of interesting things to say, very intelligent. Although she will be retiring at the end of June, she'll be replaced by Beth Hammack. Excited to see what she brings to the table. But the Cleveland Fed developed the median CPI. Now, remember what I said before about these alternative indicators and what they're trying to do? They're trying to filter out the noise of CPI, right? And so the median CPI takes a different tack than the sticky CPI. Again, no pun intended. Median CPI is the 1 month inflation rate of the component whose expenditure weight is the 50th percentile of price changes. So it excludes all price changes except for the one in the center of the distribution of price changes, where the price changes are ranked from lowest to highest, or more negative to most positive. Now, according to research from the Cleveland Fed, the median CPI provides a better signal of the underlying inflation trend than either the all items CPI or the headline CPI and the CPI core, which again excludes food and energy. The median CPI is even better at forecasting PC inflation in the near and longer term than the core PC price index. So the question is, why does the Cleveland Fed use this calculation? Well, let's go back to our original measure for just a moment, right? For CPI, what the BLS does is they average the prices that they collect. They then weight them according to how much someone's income goes towards a particular purchase. So if we spend more on housing than apparel, then housing gets a heavier weight. The problem becomes when one component jumps an inordinate amount. So let's think about something like beef, for example, right? Remember the mad cow disease issue? Well, let's say that that happens and no one wants to buy beef. And so they start to buy pork instead. Well, now pork prices jump. And they jump so much that even though they may not be a big component of the measure, they move it nonetheless. So the point being is that's not necessarily an inflationary issue, right? That's more of a relative price change. So people shifted consumption from one product to another. The price of pork went up, but not all prices went up. And that's really the issue with CPI over the short term. It can be unduly influenced by these types of moves. So once again, that is why the BLS came up with that core CPI. They tried to filter out those more volatile components. The idea was that because food and energy will always have large price swings and have little to do with inflation, we'll exclude that from the data. So that's what the median CPI looks to improve on. The Cleveland Fed looks at all the prices, and instead of averaging them, they just take the price change that's right in the middle. And this way we can see a general movement of prices. Let's take a look at that particular chart as well. So let me pull that up. And so here I've got the median CPI, excuse me, along with that CPI core once again. The median CPI is in blue, the core is in red. Now, the first thing that I noticed was that the median almost looks like a moving average of the core, right? And I think that's probably the desired effect. If we think about a moving average, its purpose is to smooth out the results. Moving averages dampen the effects of short-term oscillations. And that's really what the median CPI is trying to do as well. Instead of taking all the results and having an outlier unduly affect the index, we want to get a feel for the general trend of inflation. Another observation about the median CPI is that since its highs in February of 2023, it's never backtracked. Now, we did have a moment there from this Feb to March of this year where it was a very small change in between, but it's still a lower reading. So that's something I'll be watching as well. Does the median CPI, the general trend of inflation, continue to make incremental moves lower? Now we can take another look at this median CPI, and this time I've included that sticky price back in that super core. We can see something interesting here when we do that. We have the median up top. We've got that core CPI cutting right through the gap, and our sticky super core at the bottom range in green here. So what does this look like? Well, it's very similar to what we saw with those various sticky indicators. In fact, if we plot the median and the sticky core indicators, so let's go ahead and do that. So this is just the median and that sticky core less food and energy. Well, what we can see here is that they closely follow each other, right? So other than 2020, which I'm willing to chalk that up as a post-pandemic distortions, takeaway here is that the general trend of inflation is lower, as well as the general trend of inflation expectations. So that's the median CPI. Now, if we go back again to that website, another one that they have is the 16% trimmed mean CPI. Now, this is going to be very similar, another measure that's very similar to that median CPI. The 16% trimmed mean CPI is this indicator. If we think about the median as only looking at that middle value, well, the trimmed mean is really an expansion on that. So according to Cleveland Fed, the 16% trimmed mean CPI is a weighted average of 1 month inflation rates of components whose expenditure weights fall below the 92nd percentile and above the 8th percentile of price changes. Now, the Cleveland Fed calculates the 16% trim mean PCI by taking a weighted average across the components, inflation rates after excluding or trimming those items whose expenditure weight falls in that top 8% or that bottom 8% of the price change distribution. So what they're doing is they're excluding price changes in specified upper and lower tails of the distribution, right? So for you option traders out there, think of this as like the standard deviation bell curve, right? One standard deviation captures 68% of occurrences, two standard deviation captures 95% of occurrences. This measure is capturing 84% of those occurrences. In other words, it's getting rid of some of those tails on the outside. So it's saying we understand there will be outliers, but we want to limit our window to get a better understanding of where inflation is. Again, taking out that tail risk. They want to eliminate those outliers that may affect the traditional measure, right? And give an unrealistic skew to the results. As with any other measures, looking to filter out the noise. So keep that in mind. These are just looking to filter out noise in different ways. So let's go take a look at that chart as well. So here I've got the 16% trim mean against that CPI core. And this illustrates a potential downside to the trim mean. In the early stages of a move in inflation, some rapidly increasing prices might get trimmed. So take a look at this particular section right here, right? Again, very chaotic because, of course, it's post-pandemic, but nonetheless, you can see the differences here. And if we focus in on that, we can see that phenomenon that I was talking about, the ability for maybe some of those rapidly increasing prices to get overlooked. The core rose dramatically, but if you're only watching the trim mean, then what are you really looking at is a lagging inflation measure. And of course, the reverse can be observed if we take a look over here. About a year later, as CPI core turned lower, if only temporary. However, the outside of shifts at the beginning and end of inflation moves, they're pretty similar, right? You can see as they move pretty lockstep. Let's go ahead and take a look at the 16% trimmed with the median as well as the CPI core. So what observations can we make here? Well, the 16% is actually much closer to the actual core measure, very similar to the median. Not quite as smooth, so perhaps the takeaway here is that the 16% trim mean and the CPI core are relatively tight. If they are relatively tight, we don't really see a shift in the inflation trend, right? And the general trend of inflation is lower as evidenced by the median. So taken together, we might observe that inflation is moving lower, which led me to another thought. Perhaps these measures are a lot like technical analysis for stocks, right? For example, if you're focusing on just RSI, you might not tell much about the trend, right? That's not what RSI is meant for. But if we can get several indicators pointing in the same direction, then we can get more confidence, as Jerome Powell and company like to say. So that's the 16% trim mean. While we're here at the Cleveland Fed, I will take a look at one more thing that I think is of interest, and that is something they call their inflation nowcasting. This one's a little bit different than what we've already looked at. The other measures we've looked at are trying to take a CPI and clean it up. This one is actually looking to not be an alternative measure inflation. This one looks to estimate inflation or forecasts of the present, basically trying to fill in that missing data point with an accurate estimate. Atlanta Fed does this for GDP as well. They got a GDP now. But often nowcasts look at high frequency data to predict what the next release of the indicator of interest might be. The inflation nowcasting does just that. It uses a small number of available data series at different frequencies. In fact, the inflation nowcasting uses 10 data series. There are 8 data series that are monthly. 5 of them are monthly series coming from the BLS, the CPI, the core CPI, the CPI for food, the CPI for food at home, and the CPI for gasoline. 3 of the monthly series come from the BEA, the PCE price index, the core PCE price index, and the PCE price index for food and beverage purchased off-premise consumption. And 1 data series is weekly. That's the retail gasoline prices. Those are released each Monday by the Energy Information Administration. And 1 data series that is daily, which is the Brent crude spot oil prices. The nowcast is updated every business day at around 10 a.m. Eastern time. And there are 4 parts to the model. The first part attempts to forecast core inflation. Now, based on their research, they have found that estimates based on a recent past do a good job. The second part forecasts food price inflation. Again, they found that using the recent past to forecast food price inflation works well. The third part now casts gasoline price inflation. Here they use a combination of current gasoline prices and current oil prices. The idea here is that today's oil prices are informative about where gasoline prices are likely to head in the future. And then finally, the fourth part combines the nowcast and forecast of core inflation, food price inflation, and gasoline price inflation to come up with nowcasts of inflation in the CPI. Now, typically, nowcasts early in the month or quarter are less precise than nowcasts made later in the month or quarter because they have the early nowcasts are based on less information than the later ones. But looking at the forecast, we can certainly see right now the nowcast sees core month-on-month change at 0.3% in May, which will be Wednesday's release, and a very slight downtick to 0.29 in June. Now, with the last reading for April coming in at 0.3%, the nowcast is basically looking at a flat second quarter for CPI core. The question is, will that be enough? With July essentially off the table, all eyes are on September. We'll see a total of 4 more CPI prints before that September FOMC meeting. So, of course, PCE is still the Fed's preferred metric, but it sure wouldn't hurt to see CPI heading lower as well. So now that we have a firm grasp on all of these particular indicators, I think it's a good idea to compare the numbers. So we've looked at charts of a lot of these compared to each other, but let's see if we can put together a cohesive narrative around everything. So let me start with this one actually first. This is, the CPI core this is actually the different measures that I talked about today, kind of put together. And what I've done here is I left out CPI and CPI core so we can just focus on these. All I did here was download the chart information from those charts that we've been looking at through an Excel and cleaned it up for us because that's the kind of guy I am. These are 3-month annualized numbers. So why use annualized numbers? Well, we can take recent performance to understand what that variable would have changed over a year's time. So the result is a percentage change that is essentially compared to other annualized data. The issue with year-over-year data is that the period in which they compare to, and you can see that here, if we were to look at this chart, just forget about what it's looking at right now, but just pretend it's some chart looking at a different indicator. And look at that July to October moment right there. If we had a chart that looked like this, we might create some confusion, right? If we had the exact same reading for both June, July, and October, say somewhere in the middle of those 2 readings, July would look like an increase, while October would look like a decrease. So by annualize, we could say, hey, listen, if we continue on this path, the yearly number would look like this. It would be independent of what we're doing last year, which is old data by this point. And I think 3-month is popular just from a quarterly read standpoint, right? Nice and tidy. We could certainly expand that to 6 months or 12 months if we want, but I wanted to keep our picture as short as possible and stick to the most recent data. So I zoomed in and started from July low through where we currently are. And by September, most of the indicators were slightly higher, but take a look at that sticky core and that super core, right? If we think back to the Fed comments around that time, they were focused on services and shelter. And to me, that looks like what these lines are telling us, right? It looks like we start to roll over only to see the numbers jump at the start of the year, as I've highlighted here, all this area right here. The whole first quarter of the year when inflation clearly didn't understand the assignment, right? The question now becomes, it was the first quarter an aberration, right? The most recent numbers have seemingly reversed that trend, right? If we take a look right here. So we'll have to wait and see what Wednesday looks like. And for now, at this point, I want to go to the talent portion of the show. I'm going to read your minds. Which measure is the best? How'd I do there? Not sure I would make that distinction, but here are my observations. Here we have median CPI. We've got the sticky supercore and the CPI core measurements. Now, we can combine these to get a more robust picture of inflation. If we can get the general direction of inflation to continue lower, as evidenced by the median CPI, and if we can get inflation expectations to once again resume its downward trajectory, that sticky supercore, then maybe we can see CPI core continue to edge lower, giving the Fed the confidence they need to start on the next leg of their journey in the rate cycle. Normally, I don't take sides, but I think it's safe to assume we're all pretty bearish inflation here, right? If we take a look at this on a longer term scale, we can see that over a longer perspective, these three indicators resemble, at least to me at least, they kind of resemble Bollinger Bands, right? The general trend of inflation represented by the median CPI keeping a lid on CPI core, the CPI core being more reactive, acting as a guide for the 16% trim mean here. Um, in the aftermath of the pandemic was of course chaotic, but it looks like we reestablished that relationship. So we'd probably like to see those bands tighten up and move lower. If we take a look at another way to kind of throw these together, we can incorporate that 16% trim mean here. And if we can see the core CPI and the 16% trim mean are relatively tight and moving in tandem, then perhaps we can feel confident that we aren't at an inflection point for inflation. And if inflation expectations can remain low, then we just might have the ideal situation. And we saw that last year, right? Right around that last hike. The general trend on inflation was moving lower. The CPI core and the 16% trim mean moved in lockstep, and inflation expectations moved lower. So it's easy to see how the Fed may have been feeling that the hiking cycle was working and no need to move any higher. And by the December FOMC, things were relatively the same. Sticky supercore had ticked up ever so slightly, but was seemingly still headed lower. What changed? Well, it's that bottom measure, right? It's the sticky supercore. That gives us the impression that inflation expectations ticked higher. And if you listen to anything Powell has said, you know he's always concerned about that. So ideally, we'd like to see those gaps narrow, but we'd also like to see all the lines headed in the same direction. Now, I am by no means an economist or a forecaster of any sort, so don't rely on me for inflation predictions. Today is just an observation about observations and what to look for going forward. I'm just looking at the mechanics of these indicators and deciphering what they do and what they don't tell us. But again, we're all intelligent adults here. We can make our own decisions. And the fact that you joined me today tells me you like to look at macro indicators as well. So dig in, see what you can observe. You may come to a completely different conclusion, and that's great. This was intended as an exercise in deeper analysis. So hopefully when you see that number on Wednesday, you'll think to yourself, interesting. I wonder what the bigger picture is. And now you have a way to investigate that. So thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it. This is fun for me. So thanks for indulging me for the last half hour. Hopefully you find this interesting. If you did find it interesting, let me know. And we'll look to add more of these in the future. But again, appreciate you being here. Good luck for the rest of the trading week. And let's see what happens on Wednesday with that CPI. Take care, everybody.